Good afternoon. Welcome to the RSA's online stage. I'm Alan Lockie. I'm head of the Future Work Centre and Associate Director of the Economy, Enterprise and Manufacturing team here at the RSA. And I'm really delighted to welcome to the RSA Michelle Meagher. Michelle is a competition lawyer. She's an author, a senior policy fellow at the UCL Centre for Law, Economics and Society, and the co-founder of the Inclusive Competition Forum. What we're really here to talk about today is Michelle's recent book, Competition is Killing Us, or the subtitled, How Big Business is Harming Our Society and Planet, and always important, what to do about it. It really is, I can't recommend it highly enough. It's a truly systemic look at competition law, the impact that has on democracy and society, and the norms within public culture that it draws upon. But it's particularly exciting because, and this is where we stray into kind of shameless RSA plug territory, so pre-warning there, but it's particularly exciting because it really operates at the intersection of the two programmatic areas of work the RSA has recently launched. On my side of the fence and future work, it kind of aligns with our view that we really need to shift towards a stakeholder model of capitalism, and that requires a combination of emboldened state action and a democratization of power towards civil society organizations like trade unions. But it also aligns with our new Renewable Futures program, where we are looking towards a more circular economic model, a more circular vision of capitalism. That means some of the externalities that Michelle writes very, very lucidly about that damage people and planet in the current free market model are priced in better, measured better, and actually we start to take account of them in our behavior and policies. So let's kick off. And Michelle's book really starts actually as a kind of a bit of a personal memoir. And there's almost a kind of flashbulb memory moment, Michelle, where your faith in capitalism, and free market capitalism specifically, which to this point has been quite strident, I think it's fair to say, almost disappears overnight as you sort of apprehend the Rana Plaza disaster in Bangladesh. Would you like to just kind of explain why that was such a profound moment for you and how it affected your thinking?
Sure. And firstly, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to be here. So as I kind of describe at the beginning of the book, I mean, I think it's useful to know a little bit of the context of where I came to these views. I was really a teenage conservative, a huge fan of Margaret Thatcher. I was kind of very anti-union. I saw them as, really privileging the insiders and, creating inefficiencies. And I suppose the overall message was that I really kind of bought into this idea of free markets. And I was an idealist. I genuinely believed that if we had more competition, more free markets, then we would have more of everything that we wanted, whether it was justice or sustainability or whatever it was. And so I kind of followed that path kind of quite literally and became a competition lawyer with the genuine belief that if we could only spread free market competition more successfully around the world, then we would have better economy, more wealth, and more shared prosperity and better society. And so I was kind of fully embedded within this system of supporting free markets and competition. I was working as a competition lawyer, advising big corporates in the city, but I'd actually also worked for the regulators and prosecuting big corporates. And so I've kind of seen both sides of it. And I was working on this particular deal in kind of fizzy drinks, the fizzy drinks market, starting to question, is it really right that all we're looking for from these companies is they're going to make their drinks as cheap as possible? And at the same time, more or less the same time, the Rana Plaza factory collapse happened, and that was in Dhaka, Bangladesh, and my family is originally from there. And something about that particular event, seeing people who looked exactly like me, women crawling out of the rubble, who looked exactly like me, and really realizing that is the sharp end of the wedge of this system of free market capitalism. They are really at the coalface of that, but really those systems are there underneath the whole of the capitalist system, and it's kind of maybe dressed up in more palatable circumstances in the UK, but actually, it's there. There are sweatshops that we've seen recently revealed in the UK, and certainly the supply chains have all of these harms embedded within them. So I started to really question, what is the role of competition in the economy? Is it really serving the goal that it's meant to? Is it really providing us with the most efficient allocation of resources in the economy and the best outcomes for everyone? I think these are really important questions. I mean, this was a few years ago, and just as some of these questions around climate change are really coming to the fore, we've got obviously huge questions now facing post the pandemic, or as we hope to be in that phase post the pandemic. And there are enormous questions around how do we structure the economy. There's a huge sense of disempowerment around the world, giving rise to populist politics. And I think that we have to be asking this wonderful system of capitalism that has all these promises, what is being delivered, and is it being delivered effectively? And the goal of this book was really to look at, why does capitalism tend to concentrate wealth and power in so few hands, and yet so efficiently spread its harms so widely? And is there a way to recalibrate that system so that it can be working more to our benefit?
Excellent. And, I think it was really interesting on that Rana Plaza example where you said that, it's not an accident. People describe it as an accident. It was actually systemically inevitable. And then your book goes on to kind of, with the six myths of competition, sort of, articulate the system, the overall system drivers and the kind of norms that drive them to these kind of tragic but inevitable conclusions. So I was wondering if you could, without giving too much detail so that people don't buy this very excellent book, which is always the challenge here, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about the six myths of competition.
Sure, and I'm sure it crosses over with a lot of the work that I've seen the RSA do in the past few years. So none of these myths will be a true surprise, I think, to anybody watching. But I think there's some value in bringing them together and to understanding how they all connect. So the first myth that I tackle is the myth that free markets are competitive. Actually, there's quite a lot of evidence, economic studies that have been done in recent years to show that actually free markets are not competitive. We're seeing rising levels of market concentration around the world, in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere. And we're seeing, this is really, in a way, we can see a lot of the signs of this. So we're seeing huge profitability in particular sectors, rising markups of prices, so that actually prices are not as low as they should be. So these are all signs that free markets are actually not competitive. And we also have this idea that free markets are kind of naturally evolving, but actually they're constructed by the law and by the various norms and procedures that we have that govern the markets. And we can see, as I go through the remaining myths, how that has really propped up this system that allows markets to concentrate. So the second myth I deal with is this idea that companies compete to serve the interests of society. It's true that in an ideal sense, companies go out there and they compete to produce the most desirable products at the lowest prices, and they constantly innovate in order to do so. That's the ideal scenario. But there are two other very profitable ways that companies can go about maximizing their profits, and they can do that by seeking monopoly, so seeking market power that allows them to push their rivals out of the way. They can then price however they want. So that's obviously an extremely attractive business model. And the other is to shift costs onto society. So externalities, costs that should be internalized within the business, instead they are able to kind of, whether it's the burning of fossil fuels or the producing fizzy drinks and not having to account for the health and obesity and other problems that come from that. If a company is allowed to push those costs onto society, then they don't have to absorb them themselves. That's extra profit for them. And part of the idea there is that actually, if we're trying to understand competition, we need to really understand the way that companies operate. And they have operated for the last 50 years under this model or paradigm of shareholder value, which is maximizing shareholder returns. And this really focuses the mind of businesses, of managers, no matter how kind of well-intentioned they may be in terms of wanting to serve consumers, wanting to serve society, in the end, when it comes to it, that when incremental decisions are made, they will favor those business strategies that will either push them towards monopoly or towards externalizing costs. So the third myth is that corporate power is benign. This really starts to engage with the neoliberal Chicago school models that have been so influential in many different areas, and particularly in some regulatory and legal areas, and hugely important in the area of antitrust or competition laws. So these are the laws that are supposed to be governing corporate power. And the idea was that corporate power is benign because markets self-correct. So if you were to have a monopolist, somebody who was able to corner a market, actually they would never be able to exploit that power, because they would always be, waiting in the wings, another competitor. So you've got this kind of mythologizing of the MySpace, and look what happened to them. Then along came Facebook. We don't need to really dwell on the postscript, which is that nobody has come along since then, and that actually huge power has accumulated for Facebook, both in terms of economic power and then political power and power over the whole system. And it's quite a good example to see how actually companies are incredibly able to entrench their power. And so we know, modern economics has taught us quite a lot about imperfect markets, how actually there are these opportunities for companies to entrench their power. And therefore, this myth that corporate power is benign, that it will sort itself out, if we are beholden to that myth, which we have been for the last 20 or 30 years, then we won't take sufficiently seriously the instances of power that we see, because we will just assume that actually they're incredibly efficient. Facebook is held up as a very productive, innovative company that's providing this service generously for free. What we're not seeing is all of the competition that's been crushed, and also all of the exploitation that's taking place in terms of harvesting our data and manipulating their users. Then we come to this, the fourth myth, which is that we already control this problem of corporate power with this field of law called antitrust or competition law. What we've seen over the last few decades is, through the influence of these ideas from the Chicago School, a complete kind of hands-off approach towards power. If you take tech as an example again, the biggest tech companies have been on an enormous spending spree over the last decade, and not a single one of their mergers has been blocked. Enormous mergers between Bayer, Monsanto, concentrating agribusiness down from dozens of players. Then over the last 20 years, we've got kind of 4 major agribusiness companies, only a couple of companies that deal in farm machinery, concentration on seeds, concentration on processing. We already, in the UK, we've got 4 major supermarkets that have, over 70% of the market. So you can take a whole market like food and see how actually merger by merger, it's being increasingly concentrated. So there's the regulators have actually been greenlighting this and rubber stamping this concentration, with this kind of naive idea that actually it is serving the economy, because the companies come up with very convincing stories around how efficient these deals would be. But actually, what we've seen is that the regulators are not doing their job, really. They're not kind of taking sufficiently seriously these problems. The fifth myth, and we're almost at the end, there are six in total. The fifth myth is that the law actually requires companies, requires directors to maximize shareholder profits. Actually, the law in the UK certainly does not say that. It does allow directors to pursue all sorts of different goals, and it actually requires them to consider the interests of workers and society and so on. Unfortunately, that does not stick into the mind of any director. What sticks in the mind is the enormous power that's wielded by their biggest shareholders, and the rigors of quarterly reporting and short-termism that are embedded in that, and all these mechanisms that are really there to enforce shareholder value, precisely because it is not actually what the law says. So I'm sure you've done some work at the RSA around executive pay and around this huge imbalance between what executives get paid and people who work for those companies, and that's often because executives' pay is tied to the share price. They actually become shareholders themselves, and so you have all of these mechanisms which create this idea that shareholder value is the law, when in fact it's actually a choice that we make in terms of a business norm. And then the final myth, which I think is really important to just touch on briefly, is this idea that we are all shareholders. So this is the common pushback that you get if you try to argue for the democratization of power and the democratization of companies, is that the public company sector, the listed sector, is a huge source of income for pensioners. And therefore, we are all shareholders. We are all kind of invested in the system. There was a lot of this conversation when people were talking about rapid decarbonization and stranded assets, and the idea that we would completely change the business models of the big oil and gas companies. What do we do about the fact that pension funds are huge investors in this? Well, in that sector, we've managed to kind of turn around, and the pension funds are able to leverage their power and say, actually, we don't want to be getting our future funds in that way. But also the other point here is that we are not, in fact, all shareholders. It's an extremely privileged class of people who do have significant shareholdings, either directly or through their pensions. I mean, it's no surprise pension ownership is very much tied to income ownership and income during your lifetime. So we tend to see that it's the already healthy, wealthy, tend to be white, tend to be male, overrepresented in the shareholder class. So we have to understand that all the harms that I'm talking about are perpetuated against everybody, and in fact against the poorest the most, and certainly the marginalized in society suffer these harms the most, and the benefits truly are being shipped up to those who are already wealthy. So that was the kind of 6 myths really briefly, but just to kind of, I suppose, I think it's really important to understand how these different parts of the ideology that we operate under and how they interconnect, because actually if you pull on one thread, you find that the others will come after you. So it's important that we kind of look at this as a whole kind of ideological story.
Exactly, and it's in the way we approach social problems at the RSA, we try to go as broad as that to understand the dynamism of systems, because if you don't understand the dynamism of systems, then you just pull at a thread, and even the best well-intentioned solutions don't have that kind of systemic transformation that we want to see. I'm really interested in a lot that you say there. Obviously, I think we'll probably come to big tech at some point, because they're so wrapped up in this story, and it's really a kind of acceleration of everything you said, and also what are the hardest challenges to crack. But first, let's talk a little bit about your solution, which you describe as stakeholder antitrust. What does that mean, and can you break it down for us who are perhaps not as versed in competition laws as yourself?
Sure. I've actually started to use a framing. I didn't use it in the book. I wish I had, but it's to think about the potential ways that we can counter corporate power. And that's the real kind of focus here, is how do you challenge corporate power and structures and systems of corporate power? And I can break it down into 3 buckets. So that's to disperse the power, to democratize the power, or to dissolve it. And so dispersing the power is using the tools that we already have at our disposal to hold corporate power to account, or to even remove it. So we have powers under competition and antitrust law to break up companies, to block more mergers, to be much more skeptical around the stories that companies are encouraged to tell that allow them to persuade authorities to approve their mergers. We should be much more cynical about that. We should look at things like, right now, the authorities have to prove that a merger is harmful in order to block it. Instead, the biggest companies should have to prove that their merger is beneficial to the public interest. So all of these kind of procedural ways of making sure that we are really tackling corporate power as it is being formed. The second bucket is democratizing power. Now, this looks at two kind of particular ways of doing this. One is by democratizing the corporation or the firm itself. So this could be through privileging or raising up stakeholders within the decision-making structures. So by putting stakeholders on boards, by looking at workers on boards has been one popular avenue, but you could massively broaden that out. Civil society should have maybe a role on certain boards. Why aren't there musicians on the board of Spotify or drivers on the board of Uber? This should be a natural way that a company structures its decision-making, that actually those that are most impacted and that actually have useful information to share in terms of how a company should operate, they should have some say. But the other side of democratization is really outside the firm. So this is looking at creating infrastructure that allows for the collective action of those that are currently unable to counter corporate power. So that's alternative business models, whether it's cooperatives or other alternatives. It's also unionization. I kind of see that as being inside and outside the firm, because it's also about kind of unionization at large. So in terms of like the whole of industry, and just other structures that enable that collective action. And in terms of competition law, that may mean that competition law, which is generally hostile towards cooperation, may actually need to step out of the way. So we see in the gig economy sector, there are tensions between individual gig economy workers collectively bargaining with Uber or Deliveroo or whoever it is. If they were to do so, currently they would be considered an illegal cartel, because the tech companies have been very successful in arguing that these workers are not actually workers or employees, they are independent businesses. So that would mean that they are independent businesses getting together and collectively fixing the price that they charge Uber for their services. That would be a cartel. So we need to think about how we can sensibly encourage the types of cooperation that would actually bring benefits to the economy, whilst actually using the powers of competition law, not against the small, but against the largest concentrations of power. And then the third bucket is to dissolve power. So this is to really challenge the idea that companies get to exist in perpetuity, no matter what. Companies exist as a creature of the state. They are created by the state and at the pleasure of the state. And they get all sorts of benefits for that. They get to have limited liability. They get to have corporate tax as opposed to income tax. And with those privileges should come a public responsibility. In fact, that was the old model, when companies were first created in the 17th century. And, I'm not saying we go back to all of those models, because they're hugely nepotistic.
We're very comfortable with them.
You had to, well, I don't know, you had to be like friends with the Queen in order to get a charter. So we might not want to replicate those models, but certainly I think that if a company repeatedly breaches the public interest, it should be wound up, or at least there should be the threat of winding up. We do actually already have that law in the UK under an obscure provision in the Insolvency Act, which allows for the Secretary of State to petition the court for winding up in the public interest. But it's hardly ever used. And this is because there's a general idea of the sanctity of private property and the idea that it's just kind of sacrilege to wind up a company, when actually if a company is breaching the public interest and shows making no effort to remedy that, then this company has outlasted its public use. And if nothing else, we should at least take some stance which kind of says, companies do exist for the public benefit, and they get privileges, and that's because they are huge, wealth creators. And this is certainly not an anti-business idea. It's rather about allowing the sharing and kind of dispersal of power, and this is one of the methods that might do that. So we've got these kind of three buckets of dispersing, democratizing, and dissolving power, which are all different ways to challenge corporate power.
2 days ago, I might have asked a question about how will Philip Green feel about that. The market is taking that into its own invisible hand. Mm-hmm. I wanted to ask a little bit, actually, and I think there's there's an evolution of your thinking there a little bit, which gets us the question, and it's a question that we've really wrestled with and haven't resolved in our own work on kind of stakeholder models of the future of work, which is a kind of a very old trade union argument against policies like the minimum wage would be that actually when the state and legislation steps into a space, it enfeebles the civil society response. And then actually you looked at some Scandinavian countries and there is no minimum wage, and they also have incredibly high wages because that is the role of strong trade unions. Do you see any tension in, and as I say, we've wrestled with this too, but do you see any tension in having such a strong legislative or state response and at the same time trying to democratize and grow and strengthen civil society?
Well, I think that we need to kind of think about the different roles of the state, because in this case, the primary structure of this is the state as a responder. So, this would be empower civil society, give civil society the platform, the legal rights, the exemptions if needed in order to act collectively. And then if civil society brings a complaint, take that seriously, because there's a huge issue around the capture of regulatory bodies by big business, precisely because this field has been so kind of hidden behind technocratic walls. Like, this has not been seen as a political issue, but actually it centrally is a political issue. The coordination of the whole economy and the who gets to allocate resources, who gets to have power. And so I think that there is clearly a tension in how you would implement this. You want to make sure that you are both empowering and not kind of overstepping the mark, as you describe. I think it's an interesting problem to think about, but I do think that there are kind of incremental first steps that need to be taken before maybe you iron out the kind of ideal version of it. And I think at the very beginning, because the corporate because the balance of power is so in favor of the corporate sector, you need to empower both government and civil society in order to kind of create a bit more balance. And then you might kind of shift the balance between civil society and the state. But currently it's so shifted in favor of corporate power that actually both need to be emboldened in order to act.
And that's exactly why we support UBI at the same time as calling for a stronger worker voice.
Right. Yeah.
So it's a challenge, but it is a challenge. I want to spend a little bit of time talking perhaps about big tech, and maybe let's look at the Facebook example you raised. How would a reformed antitrust system look at a problem like Facebook, where you write a lot in your book about the kind of the situation where some corporations not just get too big to fail, but get too important to fail. Something we had with the banks in 2008, and Facebook and Twitter and social media generally is now absolutely and almost unavoidably the kind of public forum for a lot of democracy. And at the same time, people don't like Facebook in polling, but they also definitely don't want it taken away. And kind of nationalization or any kind of response like that seems to be very, very dangerous. You don't want a lot of some of this in state hands. It would massively alter kind of democratic incentives. So it feels to me like one of the hardest challenges, but let's how would you respond to it?
Well, I think that one of the things we have to understand when we're looking at the tech companies is that there's been this kind of narrative of inevitability. Like, this is the only way the world can be. If you want social media, if you want to be able to share photos of cats with your friends, this is the only way. You have to give up all your privacy. You have to give us all your data, because this service just won't work. And I think that we've bought into that, and it was great. There was like a whole honeymoon period that we all had where we just kind of like threw all our stuff up there. And I certainly did. Facebook, I think, came out when I was in my middle year at uni. And
me too.
Yeah, and it
must be the same age.
It was this exact thing where you were like, wow, this is so easy. It's brilliant. No downside. But I think that one of the things that we need to be able to do when we're thinking about structurally dealing with a company like Facebook is, of course, there are, all of the democratization models that I've described, that we can have a better oversight board, and you can certainly do things like unwind some of the mergers, their merger with WhatsApp, their merger with Instagram. They will say it's very hard, but actually it's not that hard to break up companies. But there are those kind of like very structural things that you can do, but there's other things that you can do to completely open up the market. So there are things to do with data sharing and interoperability that would effectively allow other competitors to come onto the scene. Currently now, if you're a venture capitalist, you're not going to, venture capitalists say openly, they will not invest in a company that is trying to be the next Facebook, because who would do that? Who's going to throw money at that? Because as Mark Zuckerberg said in his own testimony before Congress a couple of months ago, they basically find companies that are doing things that they like, and if they can't acquire them, then they just clone the product and then crush the rival. So, I mean, it's just that you need to be able to prevent that from happening, so that, yes, it would be highly problematic potentially for the state to, nationalize Facebook. I don't even know how that would happen if you weren't the American state, for example. So what could you even do in Europe? But
that, in some ways, would be the scariest state to do it as well, because
exactly
hard power too.
Precisely. But you could imagine that there might be public alternatives, publicly funded alternatives, but also more than that, actually opening up the doors to the data, which is actually the main driving engine for the size of these companies, so that other private companies could actually come along, maybe with better data protection, actually offering alternative models, so that right now, as a non-technical person, it's hard for me to imagine a version of the internet that is not funded by online ads and parasitic on my data. But it is possible, I've been told, and we just need to, you need to kind of withhold the power of the current incumbents enough so that there is enough space for those other things to come in. And I hope that in 20 years' time, we will look back at this phase and think, oh, that was very naive of us, but luckily we've got out of that system now, and we'll be talking about types of technologies that we can't even imagine right now.
I think it's a really fascinating question, and I don't know who's got answers to it, but this idea of a different internet, and what the kind of Western response is, because there is a different model for the internet, which has just power in certain geopolitical circles, and it's probably not one we would like to go down, and that's in China. But let's probably move on from that. I wanted to ask you a kind of an interesting, a kind of personal question, which is, the book is incredibly forensic in its approach to flaws of competition and the challenges that we have. Do you still believe in capitalism? I mean, is it something that you still believe is salvageable? Is there still some part of your Thatcherite history that's just needs to be expunged, or is there something really worth saving here?
So, the other day I was talking to somebody who does a lot of work in change making, and they were asking me, what kind of change maker am I? And I'm very reluctant change maker. The kind of campaigning work that I'm doing around corporate power, this is not what I set out to do. I set out to firmly work within the system. And what I realized, the word that they use to describe me is a whistleblower. And it's an interesting idea, but it's like being inside the system and knowing it enough so that you can identify what those flaws are. Because actually, I think from the outside, firstly, a lot of people don't know that we have antitrust and competition laws that are meant to be dealing with a lot of these problems. So somebody needs to point that out. But also, how it is that we've got into this kind of Kafkaesque doublethink way of thinking that we can't see, whereas a layperson would easily be able to identify Facebook or Amazon as a monopoly, a competition lawyer would really struggle to do that. So, being able to identify that. And I think, to answer the kind of question, I do believe that there are ways that we can mitigate against the harms of capitalism. I wouldn't say that I'm a capitalist, but I wouldn't say that I'm an anti-capitalist. I'm not vested in the idea of breaking down capitalism, But I do think that if once we've tried all of these things to mitigate it, I'm also not tied to the idea of capitalism. If there is a better model, then let's do it. But I suppose I don't think that we're going to even be able to explore other models unless we create space within the capitalist system, so that non-capitalist ways of operating have some space to flourish. And some of those might be anti-capitalist in the sense of like coming up against capitalism, and not necessarily like challenging capitalism at some fundamental level. But I think of something like cooperative industry, like that is still free market enterprise, but it's enterprises that have decided to structure themselves in such a way to better share wealth and power within them. So is that anti-capitalist? I don't know. I think it kind of straddles these different ideas, because if you had cooperatives at a kind of grand level of the whole of the economy, then maybe that would be anti-capitalist. But I can completely imagine a scenario where you have both. And I just think that we need more space to explore those other possibilities. This is my way of completely getting away around the answer, around actually asking the question, because I think it's an incredibly difficult one to answer.
I do. It was sensibly third way, but I know people who would say that the key to capitalism's success is that you can be a socialist in capitalism, but you can't be a capitalist in a socialist society. So on that, I think I'm gonna, on that kind of slightly weird thought, I'm gonna bring this to a close. It's been absolutely fascinating. I really feel, truly mean we could have gone on all day, but that's, I'm afraid, all we've got time for in the RSA online main stage today. Michelle, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks for taking your time to talk to us today.
Thanks so much, Alan. Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
If you want to continue the conversation online, the hashtag is #RSA competition. As I said, the book is fantastic. Competition is Killing Us. It's on our website if you want to buy a copy from there. It really operates, really kind of channels the sort of thinking and action and impact that we're trying to have at the RSA as well. At the moment, you'll find it on our website, and you can find much more info, of course, on upcoming RSA events, our podcasts, latest news from our policy research teams, and from our global fellowship network. Thanks very much for everyone. It's been a fantastic conversation. Once again, thanks, Michelle, and thank you all for watching.